The pod hit the docking arm like a fist hitting concrete. I did not lose consciousness. That was the first thing I noticed. Every bone in my body screamed at the same time. My vision went white for about 3 seconds, and then it came back gray, which was not much better. The pod had crumpled around me like a tin can under a boot, and I was hanging sideways in the harness, one arm already free and reaching for the emergency latch before my brain had fully decided to stay awake. The latch released. I dropped 2 feet and hit the inner wall with my shoulder. Good shoulder. I noted that with something close to gratitude. I stayed still for 1 full minute, not because I was scared. Because I am a professional, and professionals count. I counted my breaths. I counted the sounds. There was a deep groan from somewhere in the structure around me, the kind of sound that metal makes when gravity is pulling at it wrong. There was a hiss, slow, steady. Somewhere nearby, atmosphere was leaking out of something that had once held it in. I opened the pod access panel and looked out into Korath 9 for the first time. Dark. That was the first word. Not the dark of a room with the lights off. The dark of a place that had forgotten what light was. 17 years of it. The kind of dark that settles into the walls and the floors and the air ducts and stays there like dust. I pulled myself out through the access panel and stood on what had once been a docking corridor floor. Gravity was inconsistent here. About 40% of standard. Enough to keep me oriented, but not enough to feel normal. My boots found the floor and I stood there in the near total blackness and I breathed. My name is Kale Dravek. I am 34 years old. I am a former sergeant of Ghost Company, 4th Human Expeditionary Force, retired under circumstances that would take longer to explain than this moment deserved. I have survived 3 operational collapses, 2 crash landings, 1 decompression event that should have ended me, and a tribunal sentence that was, by all reasonable expectation, a death order dressed in legal language. The Galactic Coalition called what I did a crime. I called it justice. There was an officer. His name was Commissar Velhareth, Senior Adjudicator of the Tribunal's 3rd Administrative Branch. He moved human refugees, not as colonists, not as workers. He moved them in unmarked cargo containers through fringe space, selling passage documents that were false, collecting payment that was very real, and delivering people to conditions that I will not describe in detail because some things do not deserve to be described. They deserve to be stopped. I stopped it. I stopped it in a corridor on Transit Hub 7, and I used my hands. And I did not feel badly about it then, and I do not feel badly about it now. The Coalition disagreed. Velhareth was a protected dignitary. I was a human who had exceeded authorized use of force by a significant margin. The tribunal lasted 4 days. The sentence was delivered by a judge who did not look at me once during the reading of it. Exile. Station Korath 9. Declared non-operational following a reactor collapse in the 17th year of the Coalition's Outer Reach Initiative. No rescue protocol. No supply drops. No communication allowance. The transport guards did not speak to me during the 3-day journey. When the pod bay opened, one of them pointed at the hatch. I stepped in. The pod launched. That was it. That was the entirety of the send-off. They expected me to die. I understood that clearly. They did not need to say it. The station had no life support worth mentioning, no power grid, no breathable atmosphere in any significant quantity. A survival pod with 3 days of recycled oxygen and 1 emergency light strip was not a mercy. It was theater. A way to say the Coalition did not execute people directly. They simply placed them in situations that handled it on their behalf. I stood in the dark corridor and ran through my inventory by touch. 1 emergency light strip, half charged. I clipped it to my collar and turned it on. The beam was narrow and yellow and showed me about 4 meters of floor and wall before it gave up and disappeared into the black. I kept it on anyway. 1 multi-tool. The casing was cracked from the impact. The primary blade still locked. The secondary blade did not. The wire strippers worked. The mag driver worked. That was enough. 1 emergency thermal wrap, folded into a square the size of my palm. 1 water reclamation patch, good for about 6 hours of moisture recovery from ambient air, assuming there was ambient air, which there currently was not in any reliable quantity. 1 field dressing kit with 4 pressure seals and 2 dermal patches. And 1 data pad. The screen had a crack running diagonally across it, but the display still worked on the right 2/3 of the screen, and that was enough to read. And reading was what I needed. I sat down on the floor of the dead corridor, wrapped the thermal sheet around my shoulders, turned the datapad on, and began reading the Korath 9 Original Construction Manifest. I had requested that document during my tribunal. Nobody had thought to wonder why. The station was built over 9 years by a joint Coalition Human Engineering Consortium. It was designed to serve as a deep space way station and trade relay, capable of housing up to 400 permanent residents and processing 1,200 tons of cargo per standard cycle. The reactor was a Class 7 sustained fusion unit, rated for 80 years of continuous operation. Life support was a triple redundant atmospheric system. Water reclamation was fully closed loop. None of that was currently working. But it had all been built, and things that are built can be rebuilt. I read for 2 hours. I memorized the schematic of the reactor bay, the location of the emergency supply caches, the routing of the primary power conduits through the station's internal spine. I noted the position of every maintenance access point, every secondary airlock, every structural reinforcement node. Then I stood up and started walking. The corridor was about 60 meters long before it bent left at a structural pillar. I moved carefully. Low gravity and uneven footing are a bad combination. My emergency light threw shadows that jumped and shifted with every step. Twice I had to grab the wall to correct my balance when the floor dipped slightly at stress fracture points. I found the first emergency cache 22 minutes into my walk. It was a standard Coalition-era wall-mounted unit, marked with a symbol that most people would not recognize because it was a maintenance worker's notation, not a survival marker. I recognized it because I had spent 6 months of my career running exfiltration operations through Coalition deep space infrastructure, and I had learned to read maintenance workers' notations the way other people learned to read road signs. The cache contained freeze-dried protein blocks, 12 of them, each good for about 800 calories, one emergency oxygen scrubber, a handheld unit designed to recondition air in small enclosed spaces, one pair of work gloves, one tube of structural sealant. I sat on the floor next to the open cache and ate one protein block, and drank a small amount of reclaimed water from my patch, and looked at the oxygen scrubber for a long time. It was not much. It was genuinely not very much at all, but it was a start. I set the scrubber running in the section of corridor I had come from, closed the distance between myself and the cache, and calculated. At its rated output, the scrubber would make approximately 12 cubic meters of corridor breathable within 4 hours. If I sealed both ends of that corridor section with sealant and the station's existing bulkhead doors, I could hold breathable air in that space indefinitely. One breathable corridor. That was my first target. I did not think about the rest of the station. I did not think about the reactor or the life support systems or the 400 meters of unpressurized hull between me and the station's central spine. I thought about one corridor, because one corridor was what I had, and what you have is always where you start. By the end of that first day, I had a sealed, breathable corridor 8 meters long. It was cold, roughly 4 degrees above freezing. The light was still only my emergency strip. The floor was hard metal, and the walls were dark, and there was no sound at all, except the soft mechanical hum of the scrubber doing its work. I wrapped myself in the thermal sheet and lay down on the floor and closed my eyes. I slept for exactly 4 hours, which is what I have always slept, because 4 hours is what my body learned to work on during 2 years of extended field operations, and the body remembers what it has been taught. When I woke up, I turned over and looked at the ceiling of my 8-meter corridor, and I thought about what came next. They thought this was a death sentence. They thought a dead station was an ending. They thought putting one human in the dark with a broken multi-tool and 3 days of oxygen was a conclusion to a problem. What it was, in fact, was an inventory, and I was very good at working with what I had. I found the reactor on day 3. I had spent the previous 2 days moving through the station's outer ring, which was the section of the station closest to where my pod had landed, working in short stretches, returning to my breathable corridor to rest and reclaim moisture. I had mapped out approximately 200 meters of accessible space. Most of it was dark, cold, and empty. 17 years of abandonment had done the expected damage. Loose panels, broken fixtures, a section of floor that had partially collapsed inward, probably from metal fatigue. I marked everything on the data pad, sketching a rough layout that matched against the construction manifest to give me orientation. On day 2, I found 5 more emergency caches. That was the thing about a human-built station. The engineers who built it had come from a tradition of preparation, a culture that built in redundancies not because regulations required them but because the people doing the building understood, at a level below language, that space was unforgiving and that the person who came after you might need what you left behind. They had placed caches everywhere, behind access panels, inside maintenance crawlways, at every third structural junction, protein blocks, sealant tubes, scrubbers, basic tools, wire bundles, spare gaskets, mag bolts by the handful. I collected all of it, cataloged it on the data pad. By the end of day 2, I had a growing inventory and a cleaner picture of the station's structure. I had sealed 4 corridor sections, giving myself a pressurized living space of roughly 60 cubic meters. The temperature was still cold but no longer dangerous. The light was still only the strip on my collar, but I had found 2 more strips in the caches, and I had them running in parallel, which gave me something closer to actual visibility. On day 3, following the central spine access route marked in the construction manifest, I reached the reactor bay. The doors were sealed. That was expected. Reactor bay doors went into lockdown automatically when the core went offline, a safety measure to prevent unauthorized access to a potentially unstable system. The lockdown mechanism was electromagnetic, run from a small independent battery that should, according to spec, have lasted approximately 20 years. The battery had lasted 17. It was still active. The doors were still locked. I sat in front of the locked doors for about 10 minutes and looked at the keypad and thought. The security code was a 6-digit coalition standard. I did not know the code, but I knew that coalition maintenance standards required the code to be logged in the station's administrative system, which was accessible via any maintenance terminal, which was, theoretically, a different problem. I found the nearest maintenance terminal 40 meters back down the spine. It was a wall-mounted unit, unpowered. I opened the back panel with my multi-tool, found the manual interface port, connected the data pad with a wire I had stripped from a cache bundle, and spent about an hour reverse-feeding the terminal's stored memory through the data pad's reading function. It worked. Not cleanly, but well enough. The terminal's memory was partially degraded, but the administrative log was in a protected partition that the degradation had not reached. I found the reactor bay access code in a maintenance record dated 3 weeks before the station went dark. I walked back to the reactor bay doors and typed in the code. They opened. The reactor chamber was a large circular space, about 30 meters across, with the core unit in the center, a cylinder about 4 meters tall and 2 meters wide, surrounded by a ring of access scaffolding and instrumentation panels. Everything was coated in a fine layer of settled particles, 17 years of accumulation from the station's slow internal off-gassing. My emergency light barely reached the far wall. I walked to the core and began my assessment. The core itself was intact, no visible structural damage. The containment shell was unbroken. The instrumentation showed flat readings across the board, but flat readings meant the sensors had no power, not necessarily that the core was damaged. The ignition coil housing, a rectangular unit on the core's west face, was the critical question. I opened the ignition coil housing. The coil was dead, not damaged, not broken. It had simply discharged completely over 17 years of sitting in a sealed, unpowered space, drawing microamps of current from the ambient environment until there was nothing left. It was like finding a vehicle with a completely flat battery. The engine was fine. The electrical system was fine. There was simply no starting charge. I needed a power cell, a significant one. The ignition coil required a minimum of 4 kilowatt-hours to initiate the startup sequence. I went back to my cached inventory in my head. The scrubbers were battery-powered, but their cells were small, a fraction of what I needed. The emergency light strips ran on capacitor banks, nowhere near sufficient. I was still thinking about this on my way back down the spine when I heard it. A sound. It was not a structural sound, not the groan of metal or the hiss of gas. It was a mechanical sound, rhythactive. I stopped walking and stood very still in the dark corridor, and listened. The sound was coming from a side passage about 15 meters ahead, a maintenance crawlway that branched off the main spine toward the station's outer sensor array. I moved toward it slowly, keeping close to the wall, my hand on the multi-tool out of instinct, rather than any real plan. I reached the branch point and looked down the crawlway. There was a light. Not my light, a different light, a flat, cold, blue-white light, moving in a slow scanning pattern across the crawlway floor. I recognized it immediately. A Tribunal Sentinel unit, an automated defense drone, roughly half my size, 6-legged sensor cluster on top, with a directed energy emitter on its forward mount. They were standard equipment on Coalition installations, designed to cycle in standby mode for up to 30 years on their internal power cells, activating when motion sensors detected an intruder. It had detected me. It turned in the crawlway and oriented its emitter toward the branch point where I was standing. I had approximately 1 second before it completed targeting acquisition. I threw myself back around the corner and heard the snap crack of the emitter discharging against the wall where I had been standing, leaving a dark scorch mark on the metal. I pressed against the wall, breathing, thinking fast. The drone was in a confined crawlway. That was relevant. It would need to advance down the crawlway to get a clear shot at me in the main corridor. The crawlway was narrow enough that the drone would need to move in a straight line. It could not maneuver laterally. I looked at my multi-tool. Then I looked at the wall beside me, which was, according to the construction manifest, adjacent to a cable run that carried power conduit from the sensor array back to the spine. I had the wire strippers. I had the mag driver. I had 12 meters of copper wire from the cache bundles looped over my shoulder. The drone began moving down the crawlway toward me. I could hear its legs on the metal floor. 6 seconds, maybe 7, before it reached the branch point. I worked fast. I stripped the panel off the wall with the multi-tool, found the power conduit behind it, stripped back the insulation on 2 leads, ran my wire from the leads out into the corridor, looping it across the floor at the branch point entrance, about ankle height on the drone's approach path, which was, technically, about leg height. The drone came around the corner. Its forward legs hit the wire loop. I shorted the 2 leads against each other. The electrical discharge went up through the wire, into the drone's leg contact points, through its chassis, and into its internal circuitry. The drone made a sound like a piece of machinery that was very surprised, which is to say it made several rapid clicking sounds that became one loud pop, and then it stopped moving and its light went out. Total time from first sound to resolve threat, 4 minutes and about 20 seconds. I stood over the drone in the dark and let my breathing settle. Then I crouched down and opened its chassis with the multi-tool. The power cell inside was a Coalition standard high-density unit. I checked the charge reading on the datapad after connecting the wire. 6.2 kilowatt-hours, more than enough for the reactor ignition joint hole. I sat back on my heels in the dark corridor and almost allowed myself to feel something that was not entirely practical. I did not quite let it happen, but it was close. I carried the drone's cell back to the reactor bay and connected it to the ignition coil housing, with careful, deliberate precision, because this was the kind of step that rewarded patience and punished haste. When all connections were verified, I went to the main startup panel and followed the procedure from the construction manifest. I pressed the initiation sequence. The reactor ignition coil activated. There was a low sound, below hearing at first, more felt through the floor than heard with the ears. Then it climbed. The instrumentation panels around the core began lighting up one by one, amber first, then green, then amber again as the systems ran their startup diagnostics. The core temperature reading began to climb, slowly, very slowly. I stood in the reactor bay in the growing, slightly warmer dark and watched the numbers climb. After 40 minutes, the reactor reached a stable low power state. 8% capacity, the automatic distribution system engaged. Somewhere in the station, far above me, a light turned on. Just one. A single corridor lamp in the outer ring, drawing its first power in 17 years. I did not see it happen. I was in the reactor bay, watching the instruments. But I felt the station change. It was not a dramatic thing. It was small and quiet and almost nothing, but it was not nothing. The station had a heartbeat now, weak, unsteady, barely worth the name, but real. I turned off my emergency light strip and stood in the reactor bay lit by the amber glow of the instrumentation panels. I had been on Korath 9 for 3 days. I had breathable air in a sealed section, a growing inventory of tools and materials, a working reactor at 8% capacity, and the fresh memory of disassembling a security drone with 12 meters of copper wire and knowledge of electrical fundamentals that I had learned from a manual 15 years ago in a field camp on a planet whose name I no longer used. My hands were cut from the panel work. My shoulder still ached from the landing impact. The temperature was still cold enough to see my breath. I pulled out a protein block and ate half of it, saving the other half for later, because waste is the one thing you genuinely cannot afford when you are working with nothing. Then I went back to the construction manifest and started planning the next step. There was a full atmospheric system somewhere in this station. It needed parts I probably did not have yet and power I now had just barely enough of. It needed assessment, diagnosis, and a solution that I did not currently possess. It needed work. I have always been good at work. The Vreth ship appeared on day 48. I did not know it at first. What I knew was that the station's docking alert system, which I had repaired and connected to the reactor grid on day 31, gave a low tone from the panel I had set up in what I was now calling the operations room. The operations room was a former administrative space near the station's central spine junction. 4 rooms I had pressurized, warmed to a livable temperature, and outfitted with the best equipment salvageable from the surrounding sections. The alert tone was a simple notification. Something had engaged the outer docking approach beacon. The beacon was running on auxiliary power at barely 5% signal strength. Not enough to register on any standard navigation chart, but apparently enough to attract someone who was looking for something in this particular piece of empty space. I sat at the panel and looked at the proximity reading for a long time. 1 vessel, about 80 meters in total length, which matched the profile of a Vreth scavenger class. That was a mid-size independent cargo hauler, common in the fringe regions, used primarily by salvage crews and small trading operations that did not want the overhead of operating through coalition-licensed routes. Vreth were a species with a practical, unsentimental approach to commerce. They saw value in things that others had discarded. They were, in a sense, professionals of a similar stripe to what I had become over the past 48 days. They were also currently docking without any prior communication or request for permissions, which was either an oversight or a statement. I had 48 days of work on this station. I had restored breathable atmosphere to 6 connected sections covering approximately 400 cubic meters of space. The reactor was running at 23% capacity. Water reclamation was partially online. I had mapped the entire accessible interior of the station and was 3 days away from starting work on the communications array. I was not in the habit of allowing unannounced guests to walk through work I had done. I spent the next hour watching the ship dock through the external sensor feed, which was another system I had repaired in the previous week. It was a battered vessel, as most Vreth ships were, with hull patches in at least 3 places and an engine housing that appeared to have been replaced with a unit from a different class of ship entirely. It docked at the outer ring bay, which I had not yet pressurized but which had a functional magnetic clamp. 4 figures in pressure suits came through the exterior lock. I went to meet them. I did not take a weapon. This was a deliberate choice. I had thought about it for about 30 minutes, while watching them dock, and decided that walking up to 4 armed strangers in a pressure suit was a significantly weaker opening position than walking up to them without one. The message was the thing. Walking out of the dark in a ship suit with a multi-tool on my belt and no indication of distress sent a very specific message. This is my station and I am not worried about you. I met them at the inner airlock of the outer ring bay, which was the first point they would reach, that had breathable atmosphere. I was standing there when the airlock cycled, and the inner door opened and the 4 of them came through. They were Vreth. That confirmed the ship profile. They stood roughly to my shoulder height, broad across the chest, with pale gray skin and large eyes adapted to low-light conditions. They wore light environment suits with the helmets retracted now that the sensors had confirmed breathable air. 2 of them were carrying salvage equipment. The third was carrying what appeared to be a scanning instrument. The 4th, who was slightly ahead of the others and who I took to be the captain, was carrying nothing visible, which was a different kind of statement. She looked at me. I looked at her. She had a scar running from just below her left eye to the corner of her jaw, old and smooth, and her expression was one of the more genuinely confused expressions I had seen on a living face in some time. She scanned me once with the kind of quick, evaluating look that people who operate in uncertain environments learn to use, and then spoke in Coalition Standard, which most fringe operators used as a common language. You are human. Yes. This station has been dead for 17 years. It was. I am working on that. She looked past me at the corridor behind me. The lights I had restored ran the full length of it. The floor was clear. The air was warm enough that she could see the difference in temperature from the airlock where they had entered. How long have you been here? She said. 48 days. She said nothing for a moment. Her crew exchanged a look among themselves. The one with the scanner was apparently checking atmosphere readings and getting results that confirmed what his eyes were telling him. We were going to strip this station, she said. I know, you are one person. Yes, with no ship, correct. She looked at me for a long time. The Vreth have a reputation for being difficult to read, and in my experience the reputation is partly earned. But there is a slight adjustment of the wide pupils, that indicates when they are recalculating a situation. Her pupils adjusted 3 times in about 6 seconds. What do you want? She said finally. The communications array is 3 sections forward and up 1 level, I said. I can have it fully operational in about 4 days. I can do it in 2 if I have a second set of hands who knows how to run cable. Your ship also has a power cell bank I can identify in your hull profile. Older Coalition Standard units, probably 3rd generation. I need 2 of them to bring the secondary life support loop fully online. She said nothing. In exchange, I said, there is a sealed cargo bay in the station's lower ring. It was sealed before the reactor went out. I have not opened it. The manifest lists approximately 40 tons of Coalition-era trade goods, status unknown after 17 years, but the bay has been cold and dark, which is the best preservation condition for most of what is listed. I will give you full access to that cargo bay and everything in it. She looked at me for a very long time. You have not opened it, she said. No, why not? Because it is more valuable as a trading asset than as personal supplies. Her pupils did the adjustment thing again. You planned this, she said. I hoped for it, I said. There is a difference, but I did plan for the possibilities. Her name was Sathek. She had been running salvage operations in the fringe for 11 years. She had a crew of 3. A male engineer named Verak, who was extremely competent and almost completely silent. A young female technician named Dara, who asked questions constantly and had an energy level that was exhausting to be around and genuinely useful in terms of getting work done. And an older male named Goss who served as her logistics officer and who watched me with flat, measuring eyes for the first full day of our arrangement before apparently deciding I was not a threat. We started on the communications array the morning after they arrived. The array was in worse shape than my initial assessment had suggested. The primary amplifier module was corroded beyond use. 3 of the 7 signal relay nodes had seized from metal contraction over the years of cold. The antenna array on the station's exterior hull had taken micrometeorite damage that had bent 2 of the 5 primary elements out of alignment. None of this was, in my assessment, unfixable. Dara and I spent the first day working on the internal components. She was quick with tools and had a methodical approach that matched well with mine. She did not seem to think it was strange that a human was running a solo reconstruction project on a dead station. She asked questions about the technical work, and about human engineering practices, and occasionally about what I had eaten for 17 days, which she found fascinating in a way that I found slightly difficult to interpret. Varrock worked alone on the relay nodes, heating them carefully with a controlled torch to relieve the seized metal, applying lubricant, testing the rotational freedom of each node by hand before reconnecting them. He worked without being asked and without needing to be supervised, which I appreciated more than I could easily express. On the second day I went outside. Sethek came with me. We had surface suits from the Vreth ship's equipment locker. Moving on the exterior hull of a station running at low power and low gravity is technically manageable and practically unpleasant. The hull surface was uneven from years of unaddressed micrometeorite impact. The magnetic boot adhesion worked in most sections, and was unreliable in others where the hull plating had warped. But the antenna array was at the top of the station's exterior sensor dome, and the sensor dome was only accessible from outside. We worked for 4 hours in the silence of space, which is the most total silence a human can experience, unbothered by weather or distance, just the dark and the stars and the work directly in front of you. Sek was a capable surface operator, better than I had expected, and she had a sense for the work that I recognized as belonging to someone who had spent time operating in difficult conditions without a support structure to fall back on. We bent the antenna elements back into alignment by hand, using a brace tool from the ship's kit. We replaced the corroded connector housings with units from the Vreth ship's spare parts. We ran a new signal lead from the dome access point down to the array room below. When we came back inside and I sat at the array panel and ran the startup test, the array came online. Not perfectly. Signal strength was at 62% of rated output. But 62% was enough to reach the fringe relay network, which was what I needed. Sethek was watching me. I opened a communication channel and began composing a tight beam transmission. She did not ask what I was sending. She watched me work for a moment and then turned away and left the room. I appreciated that. The transmission was encrypted using a cipher I had developed during my field operations years, adapted from a coalition format in ways that would take a significant amount of computational effort to break. It was addressed to a routing node in the fringe network that I had memorized 7 years earlier, because it was the kind of address that might be useful to have memorized, and I was the kind of person who memorized things that might be useful. The message was short. Korath 9 is operational. Station is accepting residents. Bring tools. I sent it and closed the channel and sat for a moment in the operations room, listening to the low, steady sound of the reactor and the air systems and the station's returning life. Then I went to help Goss inventory the sealed cargo bay. On the third day, we opened it together. 41 tons of Coalition-era goods, mostly intact. Trade fabrics, sealed component kits, medical supplies in vacuum-packed containers, 3 crates of precision instruments. Satik walked through it with her arms at her sides, and her wide eyes moving from shelf to shelf in a way that told me the deal had been a good one. For her. She turned to look at me when she had seen all of it. "You are a strange human," she said. "I have heard that. You could have told us about the cargo when we first arrived. Could have offered it as a reason for us to help you." "Yes, why didn't you?" "Because I did not want you to help me because of the cargo," I said. "I wanted you to agree to a deal because the deal was reasonable. The cargo was the payment. The work was the agreement." She looked at me for a moment. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," I said. "There is always a difference between helping someone because you want what they have, and helping someone because the exchange is fair. The second kind of partnership tends to last longer." She loaded her ship with the cargo over the next 12 hours. When she was ready to leave, her crew was already on board, and she was standing at the outer docking lock with her helmet in her hand. "Will you still be here when we come back?" she said. I looked back down the corridor. The lights ran the full length of it. The air was warm and clean. Somewhere deeper in the station, I could hear the distant hum of the life support system that Varrock had helped me bring fully online on day 2 of our work together. "This station does not die twice," I said. She nodded once. Something in her expression shifted. Not warmth exactly. Something more practical than that. Recognition, maybe. The kind you feel when you encounter something that turns out to be more solid than expected. She put her helmet on and went through the lock. I watched the Vreth ship's drive wake fade against the stars through the external sensor display. Then I turned back to the station. There was still an upper ring to pressurize, a secondary power conduit to reroute, and a medical bay that needed to be built from components I had not yet fully sourced. I went to work. The first humans arrived on day 63. I was in the lower ring access tunnel when the docking alert tone came, different from Sethak's arrival because this time the approaching vessel had hailed first. Using the frequency I had included in the tight beam transmission I had sent through the fringe relay network. 3 short pulses. Pause 1 long, the agreed signal. The ship was a hauler, old, heavy, and slow, the kind of vessel that had been in service for so long it had outlasted its original purpose and been repurposed twice. It carried a docking code I recognized, issued from a fringe port called Halstead Station, a human majority waypoint about 4 days out at standard hauler speed. I was at the docking bay when the lock cycled. The first person through the door was a man named Owen Cole. He was about 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with grease permanently worked into his hands, and a look in his eyes that told me immediately he was the kind of person who assessed structural situations the way I assessed tactical ones. He looked at the corridor, looked at the lights, looked at the floor, looked at me. "You're Dravek," he said. "Yes, the message was real. The station is real," I said. "The message was accurate." He turned and gestured back through the lock. "Come on then." 7 people came through. Owen, who turned out to be a mechanical engineer with 22 years of experience in deep space infrastructure work. A woman named Claire Marsh, who was a physician and had packed her medical supplies into 6 cases that took up a third of the hauler's available cargo space, which told me something important about her priorities and her competence. A young man named Ellis Park who said very little but whose eyes moved around the station the way mine did. An older couple, Hank and Louise Drummond, who had been running a small hydroponic farming operation on a fringe habitat that had been dissolved by coalition regulatory action. A teenage girl named Penny who was Hank and Louise's daughter, and who looked at everything with wide, serious eyes. A man named George Nett, who was a former coalition communications technician, and who had left coalition service under circumstances he described only as a difference of professional opinion. I walked them through the pressurized sections of the station. I showed them the reactor. I showed them the life support array, the water reclamation loop, the operations room. I showed them the sections I had not yet reached, the dark rings beyond the pressurized core, and told them what I estimated was needed to bring them online. Nobody seemed discouraged. That was what I noticed most clearly. Owen walked through the unlit sections with a work light from his kit and pointed at things and asked technical questions. Claire immediately identified the room she wanted for the medical bay and started calculating what she would need to make it functional. Ellis Park went directly to the communications array without being directed and started running diagnostics on it without being asked. George Nett sat down at the operations console and looked at everything I had set up and said, "This is neat work." "Thank you," I said. "You built all of this alone?" "In 63 days. He nodded slowly, running his fingers along the panel edge. "What was here when you started?" "Emergency caches, a dead reactor, a Sentinel drone." He looked at me. "What happened to the drone?" "I used it to start the reactor." He looked at the console for another moment. Then he smiled. It was a brief thing, dry and genuine. "Right," he said. "What do you need first?" Over the next 30 days, the station changed in a way that is difficult to describe without using words that feel larger than the events that produced them, so I will describe the events instead. Owen rebuilt the secondary power conduit routing in 11 days, working 12-hour shifts, and when he was done the reactor could distribute power to sections that had been drawing from a single overloaded line. This brought the reactor's effective capacity up to 41%. Claire converted the medical bay in 9 days and had it stocked and functional on the 10th. She treated 2 minor injuries during construction work in those 9 days, a cut from a panel edge and a sprained wrist from a fall in the low-gravity upper section, and she did so with the calm efficiency of someone who had been managing medical situations in under-resourced environments for a long time. The Drummond family cleared a sealed bay in the station's middle ring and began setting up hydroponic growing frames. Hank and Louise worked with a speed and competence that made everything they had needed to carry with them make sense. They had not brought furniture or personal goods. They had brought soil medium and grow lights and seeds and nutrient solution, and the knowledge of exactly what was needed. Penny helped everyone. She was 14 and she was fast and she could fit into crawlways that the adults could not reach. and she never complained. She was also, I noticed, learning the station's layout faster than any of the adults. Within 2 weeks, she knew every section I had mapped and a few I had not gotten to yet. Ellis Park was a different matter. He worked alone, as I had, and he worked constantly as I had, and he spoke rarely as I did. He focused on the sensor array and the external systems, the parts of the station that interfaced with the space around it. On day 12 of his arrival, he came to the operations room and showed me what he had been building. He had extended the station's sensor network to cover a detection radius of approximately 800 kilometers. He had mapped all the docking approach vectors, identified 3 that were not in the original construction plans, and therefore potentially unknown to Coalition navigation records, and had built a passive monitoring system that would alert us to approaching vessels without broadcasting our own active scan signal. I looked at his work for a long time. "You were in intelligence," I said. "I was," he said. "Coalition?" No, I did not ask further. There were people in the fringe who had histories that were better left in the past. And the useful question was not where they had come from, but what they did now. What Ellis did now was make the station harder to approach without our knowledge, which was exactly what was needed. More people came. A second ship arrived on day 78, smaller, faster, carrying 3 people, a couple named Owen, which created confusion with the first Owen until we began calling the second one by his surname, Briggs, and their partner, a woman named Nora, who was a former orbital construction welder, and who looked at the station's hull repair list and said, "Give me a week." She needed 8 days, but the hull was sealed. By day 90, there were 23 people on Korath 9. The reactor was at 61%. The hydroponic bay was producing its first crop. The medical bay had treated 7 patients, none seriously. The pressurized area of the station had expanded from my original 400 cubic meters to approximately 3,000. The upper ring, which I had estimated as weeks away from pressurization when I was working alone, had been brought online in 12 days with a crew of 4. I walked the pressurized sections every morning. Old habit. Situational awareness, but also increasingly something else. Something harder to name. The station was full of the sounds of people working and talking and building. The lights were on in places that had been dark for 17 years. One morning I passed the doorway to the medical bay and Penny was inside, helping Claire organize supplies. She had drawn a picture and taped it to the wall above the instrument cabinet. A rough sketch, done in whatever drawing tool she had available, of a station seen from outside, with a figure standing in what was meant to be an observation dome. Below it she had written, "The man who fixed the sky." I looked at it for a moment, then I went to the operations room. There was still work to do, but the station was alive now. That was the plain fact of it. What had been a dead structure in empty space was now a working habitation with functioning systems, growing food, medical care, and 23 people who had chosen to come here because the message had said it was real. They were right to believe it. The inspector's ship docked at the main ring on day 141. Ellis had given me 12 hours of warning. The vessel had appeared on his extended sensor net at the outer edge of the detection radius, and its profile matched a Coalition administrative class, small, fast, with the navigation markings of a tribunal inspection unit. It approached without hailing, which was itself a kind of message. I had 12 hours. I used them well. I went first to George Nett, who had been the most useful person I knew for understanding Coalition administrative law. We sat in the operations room for 3 hours, going through a document I had first found in week 2 of my time alone on the station. A document I had read 11 times since and had committed to near complete memory. The document was the Coalition Outer Reach Salvage and Habitation Act, Article 19, Section 4, Subsection 7. It was a piece of legislation dating from the early expansion era, when the Coalition had been actively encouraging independent settlers to bring abandoned infrastructure back into service. The section read, in summary, any individual or group who restores a Coalition-declared non-operational installation to full documented operational status, including life support, power generation, and communications, may file a sovereign habitation claim over that installation. A successful claim grants the filer legal standing as the installation's operating authority, independent of prior Coalition designation. The requirements for full documented operational status were listed. Life support. Functional atmospheric systems capable of supporting the station's rated resident capacity. Power generation. Reactor output at minimum 30% rated capacity. Communications. Functional array capable of reaching the nearest Coalition relay. I had exceeded all 3. I had exceeded them for 40 days. George read through the document twice and then looked at me. "You found this in week 2, he's yes. And you did not tell anyone." "There was nobody to tell," I said. Then, when people began arriving, I did not want anyone to feel as though that was the primary reason for coming. The station needed to be rebuilt, because it needed to be rebuilt. The claim was something I was going to file regardless. It did not need to be the motivation. George was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled his chair closer to the console and said, "Walk me through the documentation requirements. We have time to make sure everything is fully in order." We spent the next 4 hours assembling documentation. The station's operational log, which I had been maintaining since day one, with a thoroughness that had initially been just personal discipline and had eventually become the most complete record of a station restoration in the Fringe database, power output records, atmospheric readings, water reclamation flow data, resident registration logs. On my own instruction, I had been keeping resident logs since the first ship arrived. Full names, former residences, occupational history. Every person on Korath 9 was registered. Every person's contribution to the station's operation was documented. It was a complete record. It was in fact a better record than most coalition stations kept of their own operations. The day before the inspector arrived, I called the full population of the station together in the largest pressurized bay, which was the former docking coordination center in the middle ring. 23 people, plus 4 who had arrived in the most recent ship and were still settling in, 27 total. I told them about the sovereign habitation claim. I explained the document. I explained what the inspector's arrival likely meant. I explained what my intention was. Nobody seemed surprised. That was what I noticed most clearly. Owen said, "We figured something like this was coming." "We have been here for months," Louise Drummond said. "Nobody from the coalition has been by for a welfare check. They are not here to help. They are here because the power readings surprised them." "What do you need from us?" Claire said. "I need anyone who is willing to stand with me at the docking bay when the inspector arrives," I said. "Not as a threat, as a fact, the fact that this station has residents, that it has been rebuilt, that it is operational. Presence communicates that more clearly than any document." Every person in the room said yes, without discussion, without negotiation. I spent the rest of the night ensuring the station looked exactly as operational as it was. Which is to say, I spent the night doing what I always did, working. The inspector's name was Adjudicator Vel Sorath. He was Vel, like the officer I had been exiled for removing from the world, though the resemblance ended at species. He was thin, precise, and wearing a uniform that communicated administrative authority in every detail of its tailoring. He came through the docking lock with 2 assistants and stopped short when he saw the corridor. The lights were on. The air was warm. The floor was clean. The walls had been checked and cleared of the loose paneling that had characterized most of the station when I arrived. He looked at the corridor and then looked at me. Behind me, in a loose group extending back down the corridor, were 27 people, some in work clothes, some with tools in their hands, because they had come directly from jobs in progress. Owen had a section of conduit under one arm. Nora was still wearing a surface suit from exterior hull work, with the helmet clipped to her belt. Penny was standing next to her mother with a work light in her hand. The inspector's gaze moved across all of them. He said nothing for a moment. "This installation was declared non-operational," he said finally. "It was," I said. "I restored it. You are Kale Dravek, yes. You are an exiled individual under Coalition Tribunal sentence." "I was exiled to this station," I said. The sentence was indefinite placement at Korath 9. "I am at Korath 9. I have been here for 141 days. The station is now operational. I am filing a sovereign habitation claim under the Coalition Outer Reach Salvage and Habitation Act, Article 19, Section 4, Subsection 7. I handed him the claim documentation. George had formatted it using the standard Coalition administrative template, printed through the station's newly restored document processing unit. The inspector took the documentation. He read it. He read it again. His 2 assistants looked at each other. "This claim," he said carefully, "requires verification of operational status. The station has been at operational status, by every metric defined in the Act, for the past 40 days, I said. The operational log is available for your review. Atmospheric readings, power output, water reclamation data, resident registry, all complete." He looked at the documentation in his hands. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the 27 people standing behind me. I could see him working through it, the math of the situation, the legal weight of the document, the presence of the people, the reality of the lit corridor and the warm air and the clean floor. "I will need to review these materials," he said. "Of course," I said. "We have a conference room. I had it set up this morning." He spent 6 hours on the station. He reviewed every document George and I had prepared. He walked through 4 sections of the station with his assistants, asking questions. He spoke to several residents, including Claire and Owen and George, each of whom answered with a clarity and calm that told me they had understood exactly what was needed. He ate a meal in the common space that Louise had set up. I do not know if he was aware of the significance of that, of being fed food grown on the station he had come to assess, but the Drummond family served him without making anything of it, and he ate without comment. At the end of his review, he came back to the operations room where I was waiting. The documentation is complete, he said. Yes, the operational status requirements are met. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He had the look of a person who understood that the situation was not what he had expected, and had not yet fully integrated that understanding. Your exile sentence, he said. It specified this station. It did. You have not left. No. He looked at me for a long time. The claim will be reviewed by the Tribunal Administrative Office, he said. I am aware of the process, I said. It may take time. I am aware of that as well, I said. The station will continue operating in the meantime. He left without saying anything further. His assistants followed him through the docking lock and back to their ship. I watched their vessel disengage from the clamp and pull away from the station on the external sensor display. When it was gone, I turned off the display. Owen was behind me. He had been there for the last hour, not intruding, just present. Well, he said. He reviewed the documentation, I said. He did not refuse it. What does that mean? It means the claim is in process, I said. It means the law is real and the law works. And the people who built this place into law built it to work for people who earned it. I paused. They will try to find a reason to complicate it. They usually do. It will take a few more months. And then it is ours, I said. Legally, documented, on record. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Upper Ring Section 7 still needs its ventilation run completed. I was thinking Ellis and I could tackle it tomorrow. That works, I said. He nodded and went back to his work. I sat at the operations console for a moment alone. Through the sensor display, the inspector's ship was a small point of light against the deep black, growing smaller. I turned the display off. There was no point watching the past get smaller. There was only the future, and the future was right here, in the warm, lit, breathing station around me. A year. I was thinking about that number as I walked the central spine for my morning assessment on day 365. 1 year since the pod had launched. 1 year since the tribunal guard had pointed at the hatch without speaking. 1 year since I had stood in a dark corridor in 4 degrees of cold air, with an emergency light and a broken multi-tool, and 3 days of recycled oxygen. The spine was lit from end to end now. The lights were not identical throughout. Some sections ran Coalition Standard White, the kind of light that came from the original fixtures I had restored. Other sections had whatever lighting the residents had brought or improvised, or found useful for their particular purposes. Warmer tones in the living areas, cooler working light in the technical sections. The result was a corridor that shifted character as you walked it, moving from one kind of work to another, from one set of sounds to another. The sounds were what struck me most on that morning walk. On day 1, the only sounds had been structural. Metal contracting and groaning. The distant hiss of leaking atmosphere. The sound of a dead place existing in the way dead places exist, not with silence exactly, but with the absence of intent. On day 365 there was noise everywhere. From the hydroponic bay, which the Drummond family had expanded twice, the sound of water moving through growing channels, and the smell of green things. From the workshop that Owen had set up adjacent to the reactor bay, the sound of metalwork, steady and purposeful. From the medical bay, voices, Claire talking to a new arrival, a family that had come in on the most recent ship, a couple with 2 small children who had been living on a failing fringe habitat and had heard, through the network that now carried news of Korath 9 with regularity, that there was a station in the deep fringe where people were building something. From the communications room, where George worked most hours of the day, the low tone of active relay traffic. Korath 9 was now a recognized point on the fringe relay network. Ships passing through the region stopped for maintenance, for resupply, for rest. Some left. Stayed. The population was 44 now. It would likely be 55 by the end of the following month, given the 2 ships that Ellis had flagged on the sensor net as approaching from the inner fringe. I stopped at the mid-station junction and stood still for a moment, listening. The tribunal cruisers had appeared 11 days ago. 3 of them, heavy class, the kind of vessels that were never sent to investigate a legal question. They were sent when the answer to a legal question was meant to be determined by the size of the ships asking it rather than the text of the law. I had broadcast on open frequency before they were within hailing range. I did not compose the broadcast in the hours before they arrived. I had composed it on day 90, when I had first estimated the probability of this happening, and I had added to it in small increments as the station grew, and the records accumulated, and the picture became more complete. The broadcast was the station's complete operational log, every day, every repair, every name, every meal grown in the hydroponic bay, every patient treated in the medical bay, every ship that had stopped and the conversations that had resulted, every connection made through the Fringe Relay network. The full record of what had been built, by whom, and from what starting point. I transmitted it to the Open Relay network at full power, which Ellis had brought to 92% of rated output. Every vessel within relay range of the Fringe network could receive it. A lot of vessels were within relay range. The Tribunal cruiser commander had hailed after about 2 hours. His name was Commander Veltorath, and he was disciplined and precise and made no overt threats. But the 3 warships holding position at approximately 200 kilometers spoke for themselves. The sovereign habitation claim filed for this installation, he said, remains under review. It has been under review for 61 days, I said. The review period specified in the Act is 30 days. Silence. Then, there are complicating factors. The law does not provide for complications of the kind you are describing, I said. The requirements were met. The documentation was complete. The review period has elapsed. The claim stands. The tribunal disputes that interpretation. The tribunal may dispute it in writing and submit that dispute to the coalition legal arbitration body, I said. Until that process concludes, this station operates as a recognized independent installation under the habitation claim. That is what the law says. I would be happy to read you the relevant section. He did not respond immediately. In that silence, the sensor net showed what Ellis had quietly told me 30 minutes before the broadcast. 14 independent vessels had moved to positions within visual range of the station, not in formation, not in any kind of military arrangement, just present, a Vreth salvage ship, 2 human haulers, a Keth trading vessel, a mixed crew freighter, and others. Ships that had stopped at Korath 9 over the past months. Ships that had received the broadcast. The commander had seen them on his own sensors. You have been busy, he said. I have been building, I said. There is a difference. He was quiet again. Then how did you do this? How does one person, with nothing, accomplish what you have accomplished here in 1 year? The question was genuine. I had not expected that from him, the absence of hostility in it, the actual curiosity. He was a professional, and professionals sometimes asked real questions. I thought about how to answer it honestly without making it larger than it was. You left me alone with a problem, I said. That is all a human needs, a problem in time. Everything I built here, I built because it needed to be built, using what was available, one step at a time. There was nothing complicated about it. The station needed a reactor. I found a way to start it. It needed atmosphere. I found the components. It needed people. I sent a message. Every step was the same. Identify what is needed. Find what is available. Connect the two. Another silence. You found a way to start the reactor, he said slowly. With what? A Sentinel drone and 12 meters of copper wire, I said. The silence lasted longer than the others. Then the commander said, the claim review will be concluded. I appreciate that. The 3 cruisers began to withdraw, slowly, then faster, their drive signatures growing in the sensor display before beginning to shrink as distance took them. I watched them go. Then I turned off the display and went to help with the ventilation run in the upper ring, because it was not finished and unfinished work does not finish itself. Now on day 365, I walked the full length of the central spine and stopped at the far end where the original structure met the observation dome. The dome had been cracked and vacuum sealed on day 1. I had repaired it in week 3. Sealing the crack with structural compound and reinforcing it with a brace plate from the cache materials. It was not beautiful work. The brace was visible as a darker line across the lower curve of the dome, and the transparent panel still had a slight haze from the repair compound, but it held. It had held for nearly a year. I sat in the chair that Owen had found in a storage bay and brought to the dome room without comment, just placed it there one day as though it had always been there. A plain work chair, slightly too high for the dome window but positioned so that the view was unobstructed. The stars were what they always were. Countless, cold, completely indifferent, enormously far away. The kind of distance that a human mind cannot genuinely process and so simply registers as immense and moves on. I looked at them for a while. I took out the tribunal sentence document. I had kept it in the inner pocket of my work jacket since day 1. It was worn at the fold lines now, soft from handling, but still entirely readable. I read the relevant line. Sentence. Exile to non-operational installation Korath 9, indefinite duration, with environmental conditions constituting sufficient probability of terminal outcome. Environmental conditions constituting sufficient probability of terminal outcome. That was the official language, for we expect this to end you, and we would prefer not to be held responsible for that. I had carried this document for a year. I had read it perhaps 30 times. Not out of bitterness, but out of the same reason I kept other pieces of operational data close. Because the problem you face is clearer when you can see it written down. I folded it one more time. I walked back to the operations room, where Penny's drawing was still on the wall above the command console. The man who fixed the sky. The station seen from outside, with a small figure in the observation dome. I tucked the sentence document behind the drawing, where it was visible but not prominent, between the order that was meant to end me, and the picture drawn by a child who had grown up on a station that had not been there a year ago. Then I sat at the console and looked at the day's operational reports. The reactor was at 79%. Life support was fully redundant. The hydroponic bay was producing enough calories for 60 residents. The water reclamation loop had not required manual intervention in 40 days. The communications array was running 23 active relay connections. The medical bay had treated 11 patients in the past month, none seriously. Ellis's sensor net had flagged 2 incoming vessels, one of them carrying a family and one of them carrying a mechanic named Alan who had sent a message 3 days ago asking if the station needed someone who knew how to rebuild atmospheric processors, which it did. I opened the docking protocol for the incoming ships and began preparing the welcome procedures. Every new person was a new pair of hands. Every new pair of hands was a new capacity. Every new capacity was another thing the station could do that it had not been able to do before. That was how it had always worked. That was how it would keep working. They had given me a sentence that was meant to be an ending. I had treated it as a beginning. That was not a dramatic thing. It was not a defiant gesture or a statement about human nature, though people kept wanting to frame it as both. It was simply the practical response to the situation. You are alive. The situation is solvable. Solve it. I had been solving it for 365 days. Tomorrow was day 366. There was a full upper section still waiting on a new power coupling installation. The incoming mechanic named Alan was exactly what was needed for that job. I noted it in the work log and added it to the morning schedule. Then I went to sleep exactly 4 hours, as I always had, as I always would, because the body remembers what it has been taught. And the station hummed around me, warm and alive and fully, irreversibly real.